The spit landed right in the center of my plate. It was a wet, grotesque sound that cut through the air like a knife. My 8-year-old grandson, Sam, looked at me with a twisted smile, proud of his small act of rebellion. "Mom said you deserve it," he said, and his voice sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced the phrase in front of a mirror. I waited for the reaction from my son, Dan, the man I carried in my belly for 9 months, the same one I took care of when he had pneumonia at 5 years old. I waited for him to say something, to get up, to defend me. But Dan lowered his gaze to his own plate and kept eating. Laura, my daughter-in-law, let out a high-pitched, almost hysterical laugh, and the rest of the guests followed suit. Cousins, aunts and uncles, neighbors. They all laughed. Nobody said a word. Nobody looked at me. It was as if I wasn't there, or worse, as if I deserved to be there, humiliated. I felt something inside of me break in two, but it wasn't pain. It was something colder, more final. I got up slowly, without haste, without drama. I put my napkin on the table, picked up my purse, and walked toward the door. No one stopped me. That night, at 9:30 p.m., my phone vibrated. It was a message from Dan in the family chat. "Don't contact us ever again." 5 words, no explanation, no questions, just a verdict. Laura reacted with a thumbs-up emoji, as if she had just approved a funny social media post. I stared at the screen for several minutes, waiting for someone to say something different, for someone to ask if I was okay, if I had made it home. Nobody did. The silence was so heavy, it hurt. I took a deep breath, typed a single phrase, and sent it before my brain could stop my fingers. Understood. The automatic mortgage payment ends tomorrow. I pressed send and turned off the phone. I didn't want to see the reaction. Not yet. I sat on the couch in my room, that small room at the back of the house that they had assigned to me, as if I were a temporary renter, not the owner of those walls. And then I cried. I didn't cry for the spit. I cried because I finally understood that my son had stopped seeing me as his mother a long time ago. To him, I was just a hindrance with a wallet. But let's go back. I need you to understand how I ended up with that plate of spit. 3 years ago, Arthur died. My husband, my partner of 42 years, was gone one Tuesday morning without warning, without saying goodbye, without giving me time to tell him everything I still had to say. The heart attack was quick, the doctors said, as if that was a comfort. For months, I floated in a thick fog, aimless, with no desire to eat, no desire to live. Dan showed up one afternoon with Laura and Sam. "Mom, you can't stay in this big house all by yourself," he said, and he sounded concerned. "Please come live with us. We'll be together, as a family." I smiled for the first time in weeks. I thought it was a sign that Arthur was watching over me from wherever he was, sending me back into the arms of my son. How naive I was. The reality was different. They didn't own their own house. They were renting a small apartment, struggling with debts, with bills that piled up like a mountain too impossible to climb. So Dan proposed something to me that seemed reasonable at the time. "Mom, sell your house and give us the money for a down payment on a new one. We'll all live together. You'll have your space, and we'll have ours. It will be perfect." I hesitated. That house was the last piece of Arthur I had left. Every corner had his scent, his laugh, his presence. But Dan insisted. Laura did too, with that sweet, manipulative voice that I later learned to recognize. "Lucy, think about Sam. He needs stability, a good school, a yard to play in. You'd want that for your grandson, wouldn't you?" And I said yes. I sold the house for $280,000. I gave them $150,000 for the down payment. The rest I put into a savings account for emergencies. Emergencies that, as I would discover later, only applied when it was convenient for them. At first, everything seemed to work. The new house was nice, spacious, with a backyard where Sam could run with his dog. I had a room on the first floor near the kitchen. It wasn't big, but it was mine. Or so I thought. The first few months were about adjusting. I cooked, I cleaned, I took care of Sam when Dan and Laura went out. I told myself that I was contributing, that it was part of the deal. But little by little, things began to change. Laura started making comments. "Lucy, did you leave the lights on again? Electricity is so expensive. Lucy, could you not use so much hot water? Lucy, Sam says you gave him cookies before dinner, and now he won't eat." Always with that forced smile, always with that tone that seemed friendly but hid venom. Dan never said anything. When I tried to talk to him, he would look away. "Mum, you know how Laura is. She's stressed with work. Just ignore her." But I didn't ignore her, because each comment was a small stone that added to the weight I was already carrying on my shoulders. Then came the rules. I couldn't invite friends over without a week's notice. I couldn't watch television in the living room after 8 p.m. because they wanted privacy. I couldn't cook certain foods because Laura didn't like the smell. My space was shrinking, inch by inch, until I felt like I was living in a glass box where everyone could see me but no one really saw me. And the worst part was Sam. My grandson, whom I adored, for whom I bought toys and clothes with my pension, started treating me as if I were the maid. "Grandma, get me some water. Grandma, pick up my shoes. Grandma, move, I'm watching TV." And when I tried to correct him, Laura would intervene. "Oh, Lucy, he's just a child. Don't be so hard on him." But she never corrected him either. She just hugged him and looked at me with those eyes that clearly said, "You have no authority here." Then came that dinner, the Sunday of my humiliation. Laura had invited her family, something she did often without asking me. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking, preparing salads, baking bread, marinating the meat. No one thanked me. When we sat down at the table, I took my usual spot, in the corner, far from the head of the table where Dan and Laura presided, like the king and queen of a kingdom that I myself had financed. The conversation flowed, and laughter filled the dining room. I ate in silence, invisible, until Sam got up from his chair, walked over to me, and spit on my plate. "Mum said you deserve it." And everyone laughed. In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The love I felt for them had turned to ash. That same night, after receiving Dan's message, I made a decision. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to explain. I wasn't going to humiliate myself anymore. I was simply going to cut the tie that bound me to that house, to that family that no longer wanted me. I went into my bank account and cancelled the automatic payment of $1,200 a month that I paid for the mortgage. That money represented almost my entire pension, the money that Arthur and I had saved during decades of honest work. And I was giving it away to people who treated me worse than an old piece of furniture. No more. At 9:45 that night, my phone started vibrating non-stop. Calls, messages, desperate voicemails. I left it there, on the nightstand, vibrating like a dying insect. I didn't answer. That night I slept better than I had in months. The next morning I woke up with a strange clarity, as if someone had cleaned the windows of my mind during the night. I turned on the phone and saw 83 notifications. 83. Messages from Dan, from Laura, even from Laura's mum, a woman I barely knew. but who was now writing me entire paragraphs about family responsibility and the selfishness of older people. I read a few, not all of them. Dan was oscillating between begging and threatening. "Mom, you can't do this to us. Mom, think about Sam. Mom, you're going to leave us on the street. Mom, this is abusive." Laura was more direct. "You're a miserable old lady. After all we did for you, we regret ever letting you in." Every word confirmed what I already knew. I was never family to them. I was a walking source of income. I blocked the group chat. I silenced their numbers. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I made breakfast just for myself. Strong coffee, toast with strawberry jam, a piece of cheese that I had hidden at the back of the refrigerator because Laura said good cheese was only for guests. I sat in my small room and ate slowly, savoring every bite, feeling the silence stop being a threat and turn into a refuge. But peace doesn't last long when you've declared a silent war. 2 days later, Dan appeared at the door of my room. He didn't knock. He just opened the door and walked in, as if he still had the right to invade my space. He had deep circles under his eyes, and his jaw was tense. "Mum, we need to talk." I stayed seated on the bed, with a book in my hands, without looking at him. "There's nothing to talk about, Dan. I already made my decision." He closed the door behind him and approached. "Do you know what you're doing? They're going to take the house from us. Sam is going to have to change schools. Laura is devastated. And all because you decided to act like a spoiled child." That's when I looked at him. I really looked at him. And I saw a stranger, a 42-year-old man who had learned to blame everyone but himself. "A spoiled child," I repeated, and my voice sounded calmer than I expected. "Dan, your son spit on my plate. And you didn't say anything. You just sat there, eating as if nothing had happened. And now you come to tell me I'm the problem." He clenched his fists. "It was just a joke. Sam is a child. You don't understand how modern discipline works." I laughed. It was a dry, bitter laugh that came from a deep place I didn't even know existed. "Modern discipline," I said. "Dan, when you were 8 and you disrespected your grandmother, your father made you apologize on your knees. And you learned. Sam hasn't learned anything because you two aren't teaching him. You're raising him to believe he can humiliate people without consequences." He fell silent. He had no answer. Then he changed tactics. "Okay, you're right. It was horrible. Laura and I are going to talk to him. But Mum, please don't do this to us. Don't take away the house. I promise things will change." I looked him in the eyes, searching for a trace of the boy who used to hug me when he had nightmares, of the young man who cried on my shoulder when his first girlfriend left him. I found nothing. I only saw fear. Not fear of losing me, fear of losing the house. "Dan, I already cancelled the payment. I'm not going to reactivate it. You're going to have to figure it out on your own." He left the room, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. That night I heard Laura screaming. Her voice pierced the walls like a drill. "It's your mother, you fix this. We can't afford the full mortgage. What were you thinking when you gave her so much power?" Dan responded with something I couldn't hear, but the tone was defensive, weak. I wrapped myself in a blanket and closed my eyes, trying to remember when exactly all of this had started. Had it been from the beginning? Or was there a specific moment when I stopped being a mother and became an ATM? I thought of Arthur. He would have never allowed this. Arthur had a spine of steel when it came to dignity. If he were alive, he would have kicked Dan out of the house the same day of the spitting incident. But Arthur wasn't here. And I had spent 3 years trying to fill that void by being compliant, by being useful, by being invisible. Now I understood that had been a mistake. People don't value what they get without effort. They just take it as if it's their right. The following days were strange. I was still living in that house, but it was as if I inhabited a parallel universe. They pretended I didn't exist. I pretended that didn't hurt. I cooked for myself alone, ate in my room, and went for walks in the afternoons, just so I wouldn't run into anyone. One morning, while making tea, I heard Sam ask Laura, "Mummy, why isn't Grandma talking to us anymore?" And Laura responded with that sweet, poisonous voice, "Because Grandma is selfish, my love. She only thinks about herself." I felt a pang in my chest, but I didn't say anything. I no longer had the energy to fight. I only had the energy to plan my exit. Because one thing was clear, I couldn't stay there. That house had become a prison disguised as a home, and I had already served enough time. I looked for apartments online, small, cheap, far from that area where every corner reminded me of my failure as a mother. I found one 20 minutes from downtown, a modest place with one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a tiny balcony. It cost $500 a month, almost half of what I was paying for the mortgage. I called the owner and scheduled a visit. When I saw it, something inside me relaxed. The walls were white, clean, without history. There were no memories of Arthur, but there were no memories of humiliation either. It was a blank canvas. I signed the contract that same afternoon. I had 1 month to move. I didn't say anything to Dan or Laura. I just started packing my things little by little, putting clothes in boxes, wrapping photos in newspaper, separating what was essential from what I could leave behind. Every object I packed was a small victory. Every sealed box was one more step toward freedom. One afternoon, while folding clothes, I found an old photograph. Dan was 5 years old. He was sitting on my lap, smiling with that toothless smile of childhood. I was hugging him, and my face reflected something that I now found hard to recognize: pure happiness. What had happened? At what point did that child who saw me as his hero turn into a man who saw me as a hindrance? Maybe the answer was simple. Laura. Ever since she came into his life, Dan changed. He became more distant, colder, more obsessed with money and appearances. Laura had that ability to poison everything she touched, with her constant need to control, to compete, to win. And I had lost. I put the photograph in a box labeled Memories and continued packing. I couldn't change the past. I could only build a different future. The day of the move arrived like a silent thief. I hired a small truck and 2 men who didn't ask questions. I took my things out while Dan and Laura were at work and Sam was at school. I left a note on the kitchen table. "I'm leaving. Don't look for me. Take care of the house you care about so much. Lucy." It was short, direct, without drama. I closed the door without looking back. As the truck drove away, I saw the house getting smaller in the side mirror. That house that I had bought with my savings. That house where I thought I would grow old, surrounded by love. Now it was just a building full of people who didn't want me. I felt something strange in my chest. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't relief. It was something in between. Something that didn't have a name yet. Maybe it was simply the sound of one door closing and another opening at the same time. The apartment smelled of fresh paint and possibilities. I left the boxes in the middle of the living room and just stood there, in the middle of the silence, trying to process what I had just done. I had left behind 42 years of marriage turned into photographs, 3 years of humiliation turned into lessons. and a son who at some point along the way had forgotten who taught him how to walk. The white walls looked back at me like a canvas waiting to be painted. For the first time in years, no one was going to tell me what color to choose. No one was going to judge me for leaving a light on or for cooking something that smelled too strong. This space was mine, completely mine. I sat on the floor because I didn't have any furniture yet, and I cried. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of liberation, the kind that hurt because they are washing away years of accumulated poison. I cried until I had no more tears, and then I got up, washed my face in the tiny bathroom, and started to unpack. The first week was like learning to breathe again. Every morning I woke up without the knot in my stomach that had accompanied me in that other house. There were no looks of reproach at breakfast. There were no poisoned comments disguised as concern. There was just me, my coffee, and the sound of the birds on the balcony. I bought basic furniture at a second-hand store, a grey couch, a small table, a bed that didn't creak. Nothing luxurious, but all chosen by me. I hung cream-coloured curtains that let in the morning light. I put plants on the balcony, the kind that Laura never let me have because she said they attracted bugs. Each small decision was an act of silent rebellion. Every object I placed in its spot was a declaration. I exist, I matter, I deserve to take up space. And slowly, very slowly, I began to feel like a person again, not like a shadow who paid bills. But guilt is a persistent animal. It came at night, when the silence became too heavy. I wondered if I had done the right thing, if I had been too harsh, if Sam missed me, if Dan really understood why I had left. My phone was still silenced, but sometimes, in moments of weakness, I would check the unread messages. There were dozens. Some were furious, others were pleading. Laura had written me a particularly cruel message. I hope you're happy ruining your grandson's life. When he loses his house because of you, you'll have to live with that. Dan was more manipulative. Mum, I know you're hurt, but you don't fix this by running away. We're family. Families forgive. Each message was a hook designed to make me feel small, selfish, guilty. But this time I didn't bite. I simply put the phone aside and reminded myself why I was there. Because I deserved respect. Because love doesn't include spit or cruel laughter. Because being a mother didn't mean being a doormat. It was my second week in the apartment when I met Delia. She lived in the apartment next door, a woman in her 70s with completely white hair and a smile that seemed to light up even the darkest corners. We ran into each other in the hallway while I was struggling with 3 grocery bags. She offered to help me without my having to ask. "You're new, right?" she asked me as she opened my apartment door with her elbow. I nodded, still a little distrustful of a stranger's kindness. "Welcome to the building. If you need anything, just knock on my door. I'm always home." I smiled, grateful but not committing to anything. I had learned that kindness was sometimes just the prelude to another disappointment. But Delia was different. A few days later, she showed up with a homemade pie, without asking for anything in return, without asking invasive questions. She just said, "I thought you might need something sweet." And she left. That small gesture, insignificant to anyone else, broke me a little, because it had been a long time since anyone had done something for me without expecting something in return. Little by little, Delia and I started having coffee together. She didn't ask why I lived alone, or why a 66-year-old woman was starting over from scratch. She was just there, talking about trivial things. The weather, plants, a show she was watching on television. It was on our 4th cup of coffee when I finally dared to tell her. Not everything, just bits and pieces. I told her about the spit, the laughter, Dan's indifference. She listened without interrupting, without judging, without offering cheap solutions. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, holding her cup with both hands. Then she said something that stuck with me. "Lucy, the problem isn't that you left. The problem is that it took you so long to leave. Sometimes we love people so much that we forget to love ourselves. And that's not love. That's self-destruction." Her words were simple but accurate. I realized that I had spent 3 years waiting for Dan to turn into the son I remembered, instead of accepting who he had become. And that had been my mistake. I couldn't change Dan. I could only change myself. With Delia's silent support, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. I signed up for a painting course at a community center. I hadn't touched a brush in 20 years, since before Dan was born. At first, my strokes were clumsy, unsure, as if my hands had forgotten how to hold creativity. But with each class, I felt lighter. I painted landscapes, imaginary faces, and colors that didn't have to make sense together, but worked perfectly on the canvas. The teacher, a young woman with tattoos on her arms, told me one afternoon, "You have a natural talent for capturing emotions. Your paintings feel things." I blushed like a teenager receiving her first compliment. I didn't remember the last time someone had valued something I created, something that wasn't food or a service. I bought more brushes, more canvases. I filled my apartment with paint splotches and with something I had forgotten existed: joy. I also found a part-time job at a flower shop 3 blocks from the apartment. I didn't need it for the money. My pension was enough to live modestly. But I needed it for my sanity. I needed a routine that didn't revolve around other people's needs. The owner, a man named Ernest, was a kind man in his 50s who never asked personal questions. He simply taught me how to put together bouquets, how to take care of the flowers, and how to tell the fresh ones from the ones that were already dying. There was something therapeutic about working with flowers. They were fragile, temporary, and beautiful precisely because they didn't last forever. Like everything in life. The customers were kind. Some would tell me who the flowers were for. Others would just pay and leave. But they all treated me with respect. No one expected me to serve them beyond my job. No one made me feel invisible. It was a radical change, and I needed it more than I was willing to admit. At night, after painting or reading, I would sit on the balcony with a cup of tea and look at the city. The lights flickered like artificial stars, each one representing a life, a story, a pain, a joy. I thought about Dan, about Sam, about Laura. I wondered if they were okay, if they had found a way to pay the mortgage, if Sam asked about me. But those questions no longer tore me apart as they had before. They were just distant echoes of a life that no longer belonged to me. I had learned something fundamental in those months of solitude. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. You can't love someone who doesn't value you. And you can't stay in a place where your presence is tolerated instead of celebrated. Arthur would have told me this from the beginning if he had been alive. But maybe I needed to learn it for myself at 66, starting over in a small apartment with white walls and plants on the balcony. Maybe it's never too late to choose yourself. One afternoon, while I was watering the plants, Delia appeared at my door with a serious expression. "Lucy, I need to tell you something." She came in and sat on the grey couch, biting her lip. "Yesterday I saw a man asking about you in the lobby." She described Dan perfectly. My heart skipped a beat. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I told him I didn't know any Lucy." "But he's going to come back." I took a deep breath, feeling the anxiety climb up my throat. "I'm not ready to see him, Delia." "Not yet." She nodded. "You don't have to be, but you need to decide what you're going to do when he insists." because he is going to insist. She was right. The peace I had built was fragile, temporary. At some point, I would have to face Dan again, but this time it would be different. This time I wouldn't be the mother desperate for his approval. I would be Lucy, just Lucy, a woman who had learned to say no. Dan finally found me on a Tuesday afternoon. I was coming back from the flower shop, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers that Ernest had given me because some petals were wilted and he couldn't sell them anymore. Sunflowers were always my favorite flowers, something Dan used to know when he was a child. Now he probably didn't even remember my favorite color. I saw him waiting by the building's door, with his hands in his pockets and that hunched posture he adopted when he knew he had done something wrong. My first instinct was to turn around and run away, but I was 66 years old. I no longer ran from anything. Besides, this had to happen at some point. I took a deep breath, adjusted the sunflowers in my arms as if they were a shield, and walked toward him. When he saw me, his face lit up with something akin to relief. "Mum, I found you." "Thank God. I've been looking for you for weeks." My voice came out colder than I expected. "What do you want, Dan?" He blinked, surprised by my tone. "I need to talk to you. Can we go up?" I shook my head. "Here is fine." He was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. Finally, he said, "Mum, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I didn't defend you that night. I'm sorry I let Laura treat you badly. I'm sorry I sent you that message. It was horrible of me." The words sounded rehearsed, as if he had practiced them in front of a mirror many times. But they didn't sound sincere. They sounded desperate. "What do you really want, Dan?" I repeated, crossing my arms. "Because I know you didn't come all this way just to apologize." He looked down, ashamed. "We're in trouble. Mum, we can't afford the full mortgage. The bank sent us a notice. If we don't pay the 3 months past due plus the next one, they're going to take the house from us." There it was, the truth beneath the apologies. He hadn't come because he missed me. He had come because he needed my money. I felt a mix of disappointment and clarity. The disappointment of confirming what I already knew, the clarity of knowing exactly what to do. "How much do you need?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. He swallowed. $4,800. It was my turn to be quiet. $4,800 was almost all I had left in savings after paying the deposit and the first few months of rent for the apartment. If I gave him that money, I would be vulnerable, without a safety net. But Dan was looking at me with those eyes I remembered from his childhood, those eyes that asked me for ice cream or permission to stay up late. Except he wasn't a child anymore. He was a 42-year-old man who had allowed his son to humiliate me and his wife to poison my life. "Mum, please," he said, and his voice broke a little. "I know I don't deserve your help. I know I was a bad son, but Sam is going to lose his house. He's going to have to change schools. He's going to have to leave his friends. Can you live with that?" There it was again, the emotional manipulation disguised as paternal concern. He used Sam as a shield, knowing that was my weak spot. But something had changed in me during those months of solitude. I no longer bit the bait so easily. "Dan," I responded slowly, choosing each word with care. "Sam spit on my plate because you and Laura taught him that it was okay to disrespect me. Sam is not going to learn anything if you two keep expecting me to solve your problems." He opened his mouth to protest, but I raised my hand. "I'm not finished. Having said that, I'm not going to let an 8-year-old child pay for his parents' mistakes. I'm going to help you, but not in the way you expect." His face lit up with hope. "Yes, Mum, thank you. I knew that." I interrupted him. "I'm going to pay for 40% of what you owe. $1,920. Not $1 more. And I'm not going to deposit it into your account. I'm going to pay it directly to the bank. Also, this doesn't mean we're going back to the way we were. I'm not coming back to this house. I'm not going to start paying your monthly mortgage again. This is a one-time thing for Sam, not for you two. Do you understand?" The hope on his face turned into frustration. "But Mum, that's not enough. We need the full $4,800. Then get the rest," I said firmly. "Get a loan, sell something. Get a second job. Do what millions of people do when they have financial responsibilities. But don't count on me to save you every time." Dan turned pale. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. I couldn't believe what I was saying either, but it felt right. For the first time in years, I was setting boundaries. "You can't do this to us," he said, and his voice rose. "We're your family. You got us into this by giving us that money for the down payment. Now you have an obligation to help us keep it." I laughed. It was a bitter laugh that surprised even me. "Obligation?" I said. "Dan, I gave you $150,000. I paid the mortgage for 3 years. I fed you, cleaned your house, took care of your son, and in return, I received contempt, humiliation, and spit on my plate. My obligation ended that night. What I'm offering now is more than you deserve." He stood there in silence, breathing heavily. I could see the anger and powerlessness fighting on his face. Finally, he said, "Laura was right about you. You're selfish. You only think about yourself." His words should have hurt. 3 months ago, they would have devastated me. But now I only felt pity. Pity for the man he had become, for the child he used to be who was buried under layers of resentment and cowardice. If taking care of myself makes me selfish, then yes, I'm selfish, I said calmly. And you know what, Dan? That's okay. I've spent 66 years taking care of others. I took care of your father for 42 years. I took care of you for over 40 years. I took care of Sam when you didn't want to. Now it's my turn to take care of myself. And if that seems selfish to you, that's your problem, not mine. I took a notepad from my purse. I tore off a page and wrote the name of the bank and my account information. Tomorrow I'm going to make the transfer, $1,920. After that, I don't want you to look for me again unless it's for a real apology, not to ask me for money. I held out the paper to him. He took it with trembling hands, looking at it as if it were a personal insult. "This isn't enough, Mom." "I know," I responded, "but it's all you're going to get. Now go." "I have things to do." He stood there for a moment longer, searching for something to say, some way to manipulate me as he used to. But I was no longer the same woman. Finally, he turned and walked toward his car. He didn't look back. I went up to my apartment with my legs trembling. I closed the door, placed the sunflowers on the table, and collapsed onto the couch. I had done the right thing. I knew it. But it still hurt. It hurt to have seen my son turn into a stranger. It hurt to know that our relationship would probably never be what it was again. But there was also something else, a strange feeling of power, of control over my own life. I had set a boundary. I had said no, and the world hadn't ended. Dan hadn't died. I hadn't died. We had simply established new rules. That night, Delia knocked on my door with a bottle of cheap wine and 2 glasses. "How did it go?" she asked bluntly. I told her everything while we drank wine on my small balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. When I finished, she raised her glass. "To boundaries," she said, "to mothers who finally learned to say no." We toasted, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled for real. The next morning, I went to the bank and made the transfer. $1,920, exactly 40%. I asked for a printed receipt and saved it in a folder, just in case. I didn't trust that Dan wouldn't try to say later that he never received the money. When I left the bank, I felt lighter. Not because I had helped, but because I had done it on my own terms. I hadn't given in to the pressure. I hadn't sacrificed my financial security for their irresponsibility. I had found a middle ground between maternal love and self-love. And that balance, fragile as it was, felt like a victory. I walked to the flower shop feeling the sun on my face, and for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a promise that I could be happy, even without my son's approval, even without the family I always thought I would have. I could be happy, just being me. 3 months went by without any news from Dan. 3 months in which I built a routine that didn't depend on anyone but myself. I woke up at 7, made coffee, and watered my balcony plants. Then I went to the flower shop where Ernest had given me more responsibilities. I now opened the store twice a week and managed the inventory. In the afternoons, I took my painting class, where I had just finished a portrait of Arthur from memory, with those eyes that always seemed to understand everything without the need for words. On weekends, Delia and I explored flea markets, had coffee at new places, and went to the movies to watch films that made us cry or laugh without shame. It was a simple, small life compared to what I once had. But it was mine, and that made it infinitely more valuable than that big house where I lived as a ghost paying bills. My phone remained silent. Sometimes I wondered if Dan had gotten the rest of the money, if Sam was still at the same school, if Laura was still poisoning my son against me. But they were fleeting thoughts, like clouds crossing the sky without stopping. Then the message came. It was a Wednesday night. I was finishing painting some daisies on a small canvas when my phone vibrated. An unknown number. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity got the best of me. It was Laura. "Lucy, I need to talk to you. It's urgent. Please." My first instinct was to delete the message and block the number. Laura had never been kind to me. And now that she needed something, she suddenly remembered my name. But there was something about that "please" that sounded different. It wasn't manipulative. It was desperate. I waited a full day before responding. Finally, I wrote, "What's wrong?" Her response arrived in less than a minute. "It's Sam. He's in the hospital. Pneumonia. It's serious." My heart stopped. All the resentment, all the anger, all the distance I had carefully built evaporated in a second. Sam. My grandson. The boy who spit on my plate, but who also used to hug me and call me his favorite grandma when he was younger. "Which hospital?" I wrote with trembling hands. She gave me the address. She ended the message with, "Dan doesn't want you to come. He says you've done enough damage, but I think Sam needs you. Please." I stared at the phone for several minutes, feeling the walls of the apartment close in around me. I could ignore the message. I could tell myself that they had made their decision, that they had cut me out of their lives, that now they had to face the consequences alone. It would be the fair, logical thing to do, what any person with dignity would do. But then I remembered something Arthur used to tell me when we argued. "Lucy, you can be right, or you can have peace." Rarely can you have both at the same time. And in that moment, I understood that it wasn't about Dan or Laura. It was about Sam, an 8-year-old boy who was sick, who was probably scared, who didn't fully understand what he had done that night at dinner. I could punish Dan by staying home, but I would also be punishing Sam, and that was not something I could live with. I put on my coat, grabbed my purse, and headed to the hospital. Delia saw me from her door. "Is everything okay?" she asked with concern. "It's my grandson," I replied. "He's sick." She nodded, understanding everything without needing more explanations. "Go, do what you have to do, but don't lose yourself in the process." The hospital smelled of disinfectant and silent desperation. I walked down the white hallways, following the signs, until I reached the pediatric ward. Laura was sitting in a green plastic chair outside a room, with her face in her hands. When she saw me, she stood up immediately. Her eyes were red, swollen from so much crying. "Lucy, you came. Thank you. I didn't know if you would." I didn't answer. I just asked, "How is he?" She swallowed, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "He has bilateral pneumonia. They gave him intravenous antibiotics, but the fever isn't going down. The doctors say the next 48 hours are critical. If the infection doesn't respond to the treatment—" Her voice broke, and she couldn't finish the sentence. I felt an enormous weight in my chest, as if someone had put stones on my lungs. "Can I see him?" Laura nodded, but put a hand on my arm. "Dan is inside. He doesn't know I called you. He's going to be angry when he sees you." "I don't care," I said. And it was true. Dan could be as angry as he wanted. I hadn't come for him. I opened the room door, and the first thing I saw was Sam, so small in that hospital bed, connected to tubes and monitors that beeped softly. His skin was pale, almost transparent, and he was breathing with difficulty even with the oxygen mask. Dan was sitting next to the bed, holding Sam's tiny hand. When he saw me come in, his face transformed into a mixture of surprise and rage. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, trying not to raise his voice so he wouldn't wake Sam. "I came to see my grandson," I responded calmly, walking toward the bed. Dan stood up, blocking my way. "I told you I didn't want to see you. You have no right to be here after abandoning us." I looked him straight in the eyes. "I didn't abandon you, Dan. I left because you treated me like garbage. But Sam is different. He's a child, and I'm not going to let my pride or your anger stop me from being here when he needs me." Dan clenched his fists, but didn't say anything else. He knew I was right. He knew that if he kicked me out of the hospital at that moment, he would be the one who looked like the villain. He stepped aside, defeated, and sat down again next to the bed. I approached from the other side and looked at Sam. Even asleep and sick, he was still beautiful. He had Dan's features, but Arthur's nose. He was a mixture of all of us. A piece of family history breathing with difficulty under hospital sheets. I sat in the empty chair and just stayed there, watching him breathe. The minutes passed slowly, heavily. The only sound was the constant beeping of the monitors and Sam's labored breathing. Dan didn't talk to me. I didn't talk to him. We were united only by the shared fear of losing that child. Laura came in and out every half hour, bringing coffee that no one drank, and updates from nurses that didn't say anything new. I spent the whole night there. Not because Dan asked me to, not because Laura expected me to, but because it was the right thing to do. Because being a grandma wasn't something I could turn off and on whenever it was convenient. It was part of who I was, even when it hurt, even when it wasn't reciprocated. At 4 in the morning, Sam opened his eyes. He looked around, confused, adjusting to the dim lights and strange sounds. When he saw me, he blinked several times, as if he couldn't believe I was there. "Grandma," he whispered in a hoarse voice. "I'm right here, my love," I said, taking his hand. "I'm right here." He squeezed my hand weakly and closed his eyes again, but there was something in that gesture, something in the way he held on to me, that told me everything I needed to know. He had missed me. Maybe he didn't fully understand it. Maybe he didn't know why I had left. But he had missed me. The next day, the fever started to go down. The antibiotics were finally working. The doctors said Sam was out of danger, but he would need to stay in the hospital for at least another week for monitoring. Dan and Laura visibly relaxed, as if someone had removed a rope that was strangling them. I also felt relief, but it was a complicated relief, mixed with the uncertainty of what would happen now. Would I go back to my apartment and continue with my life as if nothing had happened? Or had this changed something? Laura was the first to break the awkward silence. "Lucy, thank you for coming. I know you didn't have to. I know we were horrible to you." I looked at her, searching for signs of manipulation on her face, but I only saw fatigue and something akin to shame. "I came for Sam," I said firmly, "not for you two." "I know," she replied, looking down, "and that makes us feel worse." Dan cleared his throat from his chair. "Mum, he began, but the words got stuck in his throat. He didn't know how to apologize. He probably had never really had to. "Don't say anything now," I interrupted him. "You're tired. We're all tired. Let's just focus on Sam getting better. There will be time to talk later." But in my mind, I was already making decisions. I was going to help with the medical expenses. Not all of them, but a part. 40%, like last time. Because that was my rule now. Help without sacrificing myself, love without losing myself. I had already called the hospital and asked how much everything would cost. Dan's insurance covered 70%, but the remaining 30% was almost $6,000. I would pay $2,400, directly to the hospital, not to them, without conditions, without expectations of eternal gratitude, without expecting this to fix our relationship, just because it was the right thing to do. That afternoon, while Sam was sleeping and Dan had gone out to get food, Laura sat down next to me. "Lucy, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." I nodded, preparing myself for whatever was to come. She took a deep breath. "I was a bad person to you. A terrible person. I treated you like you were a burden when in reality you were the only reason we had this house. I poisoned Dan against you because I was jealous. Jealous that he loved you more than me. Jealous of your history with him, of the memories you shared, of the way he talked about you when we were newly married. Then I decided that if I couldn't compete with you, I was going to destroy you. And I succeeded. I made you feel so miserable that you left. And now, seeing Sam there, thinking I could have lost him, I understand that I destroyed the only thing that really mattered: family." Her words took me by surprise. I didn't expect honesty. I didn't expect vulnerability. I expected excuses, justifications, more manipulation disguised as an apology. But this was different. This sounded real. "I don't know what to say," I finally admitted. Laura wiped away a tear. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. I needed you to understand that this is exactly what I did. And if you never forgive me, I'll understand. But please, don't punish Sam for my mistakes. He needs you. And I think you need him too. She was right. Sam was innocent in all of this. He was just a child who had been raised in a toxic environment, who had learned behaviors from the adults around him. But children can unlearn. Children can change. Adults can too, though it's harder. I'm going to be here for Sam, I said finally, but I'm not going back to that house. I'm not going to be who I was again. If you want me to be a part of your lives, it's going to be on my terms. With respect. With boundaries. With dignity. Can you live with that? Laura nodded quickly. I can. I promise. Time would tell if that was a promise she could keep. Sam was discharged from the hospital a week later, weak but smiling. I watched him walk to the car leaning on Dan, and something in my chest loosened. I had spent every day of that week visiting him, bringing him coloring books, reading him stories with funny voices that made him laugh even when his chest hurt. Dan and Laura had given me space, respecting the boundaries I had set. They didn't pressure me to stay longer. They didn't ask me to come back to the house. They just thanked me every time I arrived and every time I left. It was strange, that new respect. Awkward, like a shoe that doesn't yet fit the foot. But it was a start. The day Sam was discharged, Laura called me aside in the hospital parking lot. Lucy, I paid your share of the medical expenses, the $2,400. It's all taken care of. I looked at her, confused. I was going to pay it. I know, she said quickly. But I found a way. I sold some things. I got a small loan. I want you to keep your money. You've already done enough. It was a small gesture, but a significant one. For the first time, Laura was trying not to depend on me. I didn't know if I fully believed her, but I nodded. Thank you. The next 2 months were of slow, almost imperceptible changes. Sam would send me drawings in a message, drawings of flowers, of houses, of a woman who was supposedly me in a bright orange dress and a huge smile. Each drawing came with a short message. I miss you, Grandma. Thanks for taking care of me in the hospital. You're the best. They were simple words, probably supervised by Laura or Dan, but they reached my heart all the same. I would respond with heart emojis and short messages. I miss you too, champ. I'm proud of you. They were small conversations, without weight, without drama, but they were rebuilding something I thought was lost forever. Dan also started sending me messages. At first, they were chit-chat. They were just updates about Sam. He went back to school today. He's eating better. He says hi. But little by little, they became more personal. Mom, I've been thinking a lot. I don't think I ever really thanked you for everything you did for us. For the house, for the money, for taking care of Sam. I took advantage of you. I'm sorry. I didn't respond immediately. I let the message sit on my screen for hours, reading it again and again, looking for signs of manipulation. But I didn't find any. I only found something that looked like genuine remorse. Finally, I wrote, I appreciate the apology, Dan, but words are easy, actions are what count. His response came almost instantly. I know, and I'm going to prove it to you. Give me a chance. I didn't promise anything, but I didn't close the door either. That night, while painting on my balcony, Delia appeared with tea and cookies. How's the reconciliation going? She asked with that frankness that characterized her. Slow, I replied, but I think it's better that way. Things that happen too fast don't last. She nodded wisely. Your son is learning something he should have learned years ago. That a mother's love isn't infinite if it's not accompanied by respect. He has reason to be scared. He already lost you once. Her words made me think. Was Dan really afraid of losing me? Or was he just afraid of losing my financial support? Time would tell. But this time I wasn't going to get ahead of myself. I was going to wait, observe, and protect myself. One Saturday afternoon, I received an unexpected message from Dan. "Mum, Sam wants to invite you to lunch. Here at the house. He says it's not the same without you. I know it's a lot to ask, but would you consider coming? Just for an hour? No pressure." My first reaction was negative. To go back to that house, to sit at that table where I was humiliated, to face the memories. It sounded like a self-inflicted torture. But then I thought about Sam, about his smile, about his drawings, about how he had squeezed my hand at the hospital. I couldn't punish him forever for something that wasn't entirely his fault. I wrote, "What day?" Dan responded immediately. "Sunday? At 1 o'clock. I'll cook. You just have to show up." I hesitated. Finally, I wrote, "I'll go. But only for an hour. And if anything feels wrong, I'm leaving. Understood. Thank you. Mum. Really." Sunday arrived with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away, not even with deep breaths. Delia helped me choose an outfit. "Something comfortable. But that makes you feel powerful," she said, pulling a pair of grey pants and an olive green blouse that she had given me last month from my closet. Nothing too elegant, just you being you. I arrived at the house at 1 o'clock on the dot. The door opened before I could even ring the bell. Sam was there, with bright eyes and a smile that broke my heart. "Grandma, you came." He threw himself into my arms, and I hugged him tight, feeling something inside me heal a little. I had missed him. I had missed the smell of his kids' shampoo, his laugh, his energy. We went inside together, his small hand clinging to mine. The house smelled of homemade food. Dan was in the kitchen, wearing a ridiculous apron with a drawing of a chick on it. Laura was carefully setting the table, using the good plates they normally saved for important guests. "Hi, Mum," Dan said, and his voice sounded nervous. "Thanks for coming. I found myself in the kitchen where I used to be relegated." Laura brought juice and sat across from me. "Lucy, before we eat, Sam wants to say something to you." The boy came closer, playing with his fingers, nervous. "Grandma, I'm sorry I spit on you. Mum and Dad explained to me that it was really bad, that I hurt you. I didn't understand before, but I do now. Do you forgive me?" His eyes were full of genuine tears. This was not the arrogant child from that dinner. This was a child who had learned a tough lesson. I knelt down to his level and took his hands. "Sam, what you did was very wrong. It hurt me a lot. But you're a child and children make mistakes. The important thing is that you learn from them. I forgive you, but I need you to promise me that you'll never disrespect anyone like that again." "Okay?" He nodded quickly. "I promise, Grandma. I promise." I hugged him, and he held on to me as if he was afraid I would disappear again. When we pulled apart, I saw Dan discreetly wiping his eyes. Laura was crying too. Lunch was strangely normal. Dan had cooked pasta with bolognese sauce, one of my favorite dishes. We ate, talking about trivial things. Sam's school, Dan's job, the plants on my balcony. No one mentioned the past. No one mentioned the money. No one mentioned the mortgage. It was as if we had all tacitly agreed to give the present a chance, without the weight of what had been. Sam showed me his new toys. He told me about his best friend. He asked me to teach him how to paint like me. When it was time for me to go, Sam hugged me at the door. "Are you coming back, Grandma?" I'll come back, I promised. But I live in a different place now. I have my own space, my own life. He nodded, though I wasn't sure he fully understood. But it's okay to visit you, right? Of course, champ. Anytime you want. Dan walked me to the car. Mum, before you go, I want you to know that Laura and I are going to therapy. Couples and family. We're trying to understand what we did wrong, how we got to this point. I don't expect that to change your opinion of us immediately. I just want you to know that we're trying. I looked at him, really looked at him. There were circles under his eyes, wrinkles I didn't remember. My son was aging, and part of that aging was my fault for having protected him too much when he was young, for not teaching him to face consequences. But another part was his responsibility. I'm glad you're getting help, I said finally. It's a good step. He nodded. I know I can't erase what happened, but I want to try to be better. For Sam, and for you. I drove back to my apartment with mixed feelings. I had gone prepared for the worst and had found something different. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a movie reconciliation. But it was real. And maybe that was enough for now. The following weeks brought something I hadn't expected. Consistency. Dan would send me messages every 3 days. Nothing invasive, just small updates. Sam got a good grade in math today. Laura got a promotion at work. We're thinking of adopting a cat. They were messages that didn't demand an immediate response, that didn't ask for anything, that simply kept me in the loop of their lives without pressuring me. I would respond when I could, when I wanted to. Sometimes with an emoji, sometimes with a short phrase. The distance was still there, but it no longer felt like an abyss. It felt like a necessary space, an air cushion that allowed us to breathe without suffocating each other. Sam would call me on video chat on Sundays. He would show me his drawings. He would tell me bad jokes that made him laugh out loud. He would ask me when I was going to visit him again. I would show him my paintings. I would tell him about the flowers at the shop. I would promise him that we would go to the park together soon. They were light conversations, without the weight of broken expectations. And slowly, very slowly, I started missing him in a way that didn't hurt. It was a healthy, natural kind of missing, the kind a grandmother feels for her grandson. Not the desperate and guilty kind of missing I had felt in the first few months. One Thursday afternoon, while I was arranging roses at the flower shop, an older woman came in whom I didn't recognize right away. She was wearing sunglasses and a scarf on her head. When she took off her glasses, I almost dropped the vase I was holding in my hands. It was Amanda, Laura's mum. The same woman who had sent me that horrible message weeks ago, accusing me of being selfish and of ruining her family. "Lucy," she said in a trembling voice, "I need to talk to you." My first instinct was to ask her to leave, but Ernest was in the back room, and I didn't want to make a scene. Besides, there was something in her posture, in the way she held her purse with both hands, that told me she hadn't come to attack me. She had come to ask for something. "You have 5 minutes," I said firmly, crossing my arms. She nodded and took a deep breath. "I came to apologize. That message I sent you was horrible, cruel. I didn't know the whole story. Laura only told me her version, where you were the villain, the bitter mother-in-law who abandoned them. But after the hospital, after seeing how you came without anyone asking you to, I started asking questions. And Laura finally told me the truth, about the spit, about how they treated you, about everything." I remained silent, letting her continue. Amanda wiped away a tear that escaped from under her glasses. "I raised Laura to be strong, independent. But at some point that turned into being cruel. And I didn't see it, or I didn't want to see it. I thought I was protecting my daughter, when in reality, I was validating her worst behavior. You didn't deserve any of that. And I'm so sorry I contributed to your pain. Her words surprised me. I didn't expect this conversation. I didn't expect Laura's mum, of all people, to come and ask for my forgiveness. I don't know what to say, I finally admitted. Amanda nodded. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry. And that if you ever need anything, anything at all, you can count on me. She bought a bouquet of sunflowers before she left, and I couldn't help but smile at the irony. Sunflowers always come back. A week later, I received something completely unexpected in the mail. A light yellow envelope with my name written in childish handwriting. I opened it with curiosity and found a letter folded into 4 parts. It was from Sam. Dear Grandma, the letter said, in shaky handwriting with some misspelled words. I'm learning to write letters in school. My teacher says letters are for telling important things to the people we love. I love you very much. I'm sorry I made you cry. Dad explained to me that when you left, it was because I behaved very badly, and because they also behaved badly. He says that adults sometimes make big mistakes, and that it takes a lot of work to fix them. I'm trying to be better. I don't say mean things anymore. I help set the table. I say thank you to Mum when she cooks. I want you to be proud of me. I miss you every day. Can we go to the park soon? Loves, Sam. There was a drawing at the end of the letter. A small house, a tree, and 2 figures holding hands. Grandma and me, the caption below said. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the box where I had the photograph of Dan as a child and the portrait of Arthur. They were pieces of my history, painful but important. That same afternoon, I replied with my own handwritten letter, something I hadn't done in years. Dear Sam, I wrote, I received your letter, and it made me so happy. I'm very proud of you, not only because you're learning to write so nicely, but because you're learning something more difficult. To recognize when we make mistakes and to try to be better. That's something many adults never learn. You're already ahead. Of course we can go to the park. Next Saturday, if your dad and mum agree, I'll bring a ball and we can play. I'm also going to teach you how to paint flowers, like you asked. I miss you too, champ, and I love you very much. I will always love you, even when we're far apart. Because that's what real love does. It doesn't go away, even when it hurts. Your grandma, Lucy. I mailed the letter the next day, imagining his face when he received it. Dan sent me a photo 2 days later. Sam holding the letter with a huge smile. He says it's his most important treasure, Dan wrote. Thank you for not giving up on him. On us. I didn't respond to the message. I just saved it. Some things don't need an answer. They just need to be felt. Saturday arrived, sunny and cool. I picked Sam up at the house and we went to the park that was 10 minutes away. Dan and Laura stayed home, respecting the time that Sam and I needed alone. The boy ran ahead, pointing out birds and dogs with an energy that reminded me why it's worth forgiving. Because children are hope in human form. Because they deserve second chances. Because they can still learn what adults have already forgotten. We played with the ball until we were both out of breath. Then we sat under a tree, and I took out a small notebook and coloured pencils. Let's draw something together, I said. What do you want to draw? Sam thought for a moment. A house. But not a sad house, a happy house. We started drawing together. He drew the walls, and I drew the windows. He coloured the roof, and I added flowers to the garden. We didn't talk much. We just were there. creating something new together, something that wasn't stained by the past. When we finished, Sam held up the drawing with pride. "It's our house, Grandma, yours and mine." I smiled. "It's beautiful." On the way back, Sam took my hand. "Grandma, do you still love me?" The question took me by surprise. I stopped and knelt down to look him in the eyes. "I will always love you, Sam, even when you do bad things, even when you hurt me. Because you're my grandson, and that love doesn't go out. But that doesn't mean I'm going to let you treat me badly. Do you understand the difference?" He nodded slowly. "It's like when Mom scolds me, but she still gives me a hug afterward." "Exactly," I said, smiling. "You can love someone and still set boundaries. That's real love." He processed my words with that seriousness that children sometimes have, that ability to understand profound things in simple ways. Then he hugged me tight. "I promise I'm going to respect your boundaries, Grandma." "I know, champ. I know." When I dropped him off at his house, Laura came out to greet us. "Thanks for today, Lucy. Sam hasn't stopped talking about the park all week. It's important to him." "And to me too," I replied. Laura hesitated for a moment, then said, "Would you like to come for dinner next Friday? Nothing formal, just the four of us." I thought about it. Every step I took toward them was a risk, but it was also an opportunity. "I'll go," I said finally, "but only if you promise there won't be any drama." "I promise." This time, I believed her. Friday came faster than I expected. I dressed carefully, choosing a mustard-colored sweater that Delia said made me look radiant. She noticed my nervousness as she helped me decide whether or not to bring a dessert. "Bring something simple," she advised me. "It's not a declaration of peace. It's just dinner." I bought an apple pie at the neighborhood bakery and drove to the house with a knot in my stomach. When I arrived, Sam opened the door before I could even knock on the bell. "Grandma!" he shouted, throwing himself into my arms. The house smelled different this time. Not just of food, but of something more subtle, of scented candles, of fresh cleaning, of effort. Laura came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "Lucy, come in. Everything is almost ready." The table was set with care. Not in the kitchen where they used to relegate me, but in the main dining room. My place wasn't the forgotten corner, but across from Dan, with Sam next to me. It was a small detail, but full of meaning. Someone had thought about where I would sit. Someone had wanted me to feel important. Dan appeared with a bottle of wine. "Mom, I'm glad you came." "Really?" His voice sounded sincere, without the traces of manipulation I used to detect before. The dinner started with a gentle tension, like when you're breaking in new shoes and you still don't know if they're going to hurt. We talked about safe things, the weather, a movie Sam wanted to see, the plants on my balcony, which now included orchids. Laura had cooked roasted chicken with vegetables, simple but well done. Everything was delicious, and I told her so. She smiled with something akin to relief. "Thank you. I wanted it to be special." Midway through dinner, Sam put down his fork and looked at me with those big eyes of his. "Grandma, why don't you live here anymore?" The dining room went silent. Dan and Laura exchanged nervous glances. It was the question everyone had been avoiding, the invisible elephant in the room. I took a deep breath and decided to be honest, but gentle. "Sam, sometimes people need their own space to be happy. I needed a place where I could paint whenever I wanted, where I could put my things my way, where I could be myself. That doesn't mean I don't love you all. It just means that I also love myself." "And is that okay?" he asked with genuine curiosity. "Of course it is," I replied. "In fact, it's very okay." He nodded, satisfied with the answer, and went back to eating as if he had just solved an important mystery. After dinner, while Sam was watching cartoons in the living room, Dan asked me to go out to the backyard. "I need to talk to you about something," he said, and his tone was serious. We went out to the backyard, where the lights from the house created soft shadows on the grass. Dan sat on a wooden bench, and I sat next to him, keeping a respectful distance. "Mum, I've been in therapy for 2 months. Individual, not just couples. And my therapist asked me a question that I couldn't answer right away. He asked me when was the last time I asked you how you were doing, not how you could help us. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time." His voice broke, and he had to stop for a moment. "I always saw you as this unstoppable force, as someone who didn't need anything because you were always giving. I never thought about the cost that had on you, how much of yourself you sacrificed to keep us afloat. And when you finally said enough, instead of listening to you, I attacked you. Because it was easier to blame you than to face my own mediocrity as a son." His words hit me in the chest. I didn't expect this vulnerability. I didn't expect Dan to have really done the internal work. "I don't know what to say," I finally admitted. Dan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know that I understand now what I did, and that I don't expect you to forgive me tomorrow or next month. But I'm going to keep trying to be the son my dad would have wanted to leave you when he left." We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of the television inside. Finally, I said, "Dan, I made mistakes too. I protected you too much when you were a child. I didn't teach you to face real consequences. Your father always said I was too soft on you, and he was right. Maybe if he had been firmer, you would have learned to value what you have sooner." He shook his head. "You can't blame yourself for loving me too much. I'm an adult. My decisions are my own, and I chose to be selfish. That's not your fault." I looked at the stars that were starting to appear in the dark sky. "Your father would be proud that you're doing this work," I said finally. "He always believed in second chances." Dan smiled sadly. "I miss him. Every day." "Me too," I whispered. "Me too." When I went back inside, Laura was doing the dishes. I went up and took a towel to dry. She looked at me, surprised. "You don't have to do that, Lucy. You're the guest." "I know," I said, "but I want to." We worked in silence for a few minutes, falling into a comfortable rhythm. She washed, I dried. It was simple, domestic, healing. Finally, Laura spoke. "Lucy, I know I can't erase what I did. I know I was cruel and manipulative. But I want you to know that I'm also in therapy. I'm working on my insecurities, on my need to control everything, on my fear of not being enough. It's not an excuse for how I treated you, but it is an explanation. And I'm committed to changing." I really looked at her for the first time in years. I saw a tired, scared woman, trying to be better. I didn't see the villain of my story. I saw someone as broken as I had been. "I believe you," I said finally, "and I appreciate the effort. But Laura, if you ever treat me like that again, I'm leaving and I'm not coming back. There won't be a third chance." "I understand," she said firmly, "and there won't be. I promise." We finished doing the dishes in silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It wasn't awkward. It was the silence of two women who had fought a war, and were now trying to build a fragile but real truce. When it was time for me to go, Sam gave me a long hug. "Are you coming back soon, Grandma?" "I'll come back," I promised. "And you can visit me in my apartment whenever you want." "Can we paint together there?" "Of course. You have your own art corner waiting for you." His eyes lit up with pure excitement. Dan walked me to the car. Before I got in, he stopped. "Mum, one last thing. I got this from therapy, and I wanted to give it to you." He handed me a white envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Don't read it now," he said. "Read it when you're ready. There's no rush." I put the envelope in my purse and nodded. I drove back home with a strange weight in my chest. It wasn't sadness or happiness. It was something in between, something that felt like cautious hope. When I got to the apartment, Delia was waiting for me with hot tea. "So?" she asked. "How was it?" "Different," I replied. It was different. I told her everything while we had tea on my balcony. When I finished, she smiled. "You know what this means, right? It means you made the right decision by leaving. Because now they're learning to value you. Sometimes love needs distance to remember why it matters." That night, before going to sleep, I opened Dan's letter. His handwriting was messy, emotional. "Mum," it began, "there are so many things I want to say, and I don't know where to start. So I'll start with the most important thing. I love you, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every dismissive comment I let slide. I'm sorry for every time Laura made you feel small and I pretended not to notice. I'm sorry for making you feel like you were a burden when in reality you were the only anchor holding this family together. I'm sorry I waited until I lost you to realize what I had. My therapist says that forgiveness is a process, not an event. He says I can't expect you to forgive me just because I finally understood what I did wrong. So I'm not asking for your forgiveness yet. I'm just asking for the opportunity to show you day by day that I'm changing, that I can be better, that I can be the son my father would have wanted to leave you when he left. I love you, Mum. I have always loved you even when I didn't know how to show it. Dan." I folded the letter carefully and put it away with Sam's. 2 letters, 2 promises, 2 opportunities to heal. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't scared of it. I was curious about it. 6 months passed like water through my fingers. 6 months of bi-weekly dinners, of Sunday calls with Sam, of morning messages from Dan asking how I had slept. 6 months of rebuilding something I thought was destroyed forever. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, heavy silences, old wounds that ached when I least expected it. But there was also laughter. There were genuine hugs. There were apologies without excuses and forgiveness without impossible conditions. Laura and I would never be best friends, but we had reached a mutual respect that felt sufficient. She no longer tried to control every aspect of my relationship with Sam. She no longer made passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern, and I no longer looked for signs of betrayal in her every gesture. We had learned to coexist in the same space without hurting each other, and that, I discovered, was its own kind of love. My apartment continued to be my refuge, my sacred space where I painted until the early morning hours, where Delia and I had coffee talking about everything and nothing, where I could simply be Lucy without the weight of others' expectations. Dan had suggested several times that I come back to live with them. "The room is still there, Mum. It's always going to be yours." But I always gently declined. "I need my own space, son. That doesn't mean I don't love you all." He had learned to accept it, without resentment. One Saturday in the spring, Sam turned 9 years old. The party was in the backyard of the house, with bright-coloured balloons and a table full of candy. I arrived early to help decorate, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Laura and I hung banners together, working as a team without tension. Dan managed the grill with a charming clumsiness that reminded me of Arthur in our first years of marriage. Sam ran among the guests with overflowing energy, stopping every so often to hug me and make sure I wasn't leaving. "I'm not going anywhere, champ," I would promise him each time. "I'm right here." When it was time to cut the cake, Sam asked me to stand by his side. "Grandma, you blow out the candles with me," he said, taking my hand. Laura didn't get upset. Dan smiled, and I felt something warm expand in my chest. This was what had been worth it. This moment. This child who included me in his joy without remembering the pain of the past. For a second, I closed my eyes and gave thanks in silence. Thank you, Arthur, for teaching me that love can also be about boundaries. Thank you for giving me the strength to leave and the wisdom to return. After the party, as the last guest said goodbye, Dan called me aside. "Mom, there's something Laura and I want to give you." He led me to the living room where Laura was waiting with a package wrapped in silver paper. "It's not much," Laura said with nervousness, "but we wanted you to know how much everything you've done means to us." I opened the package with curiosity. Inside was a handmade photo album. The cover said in gold letters, "Our Story." I opened the first page, and my breath caught. There were photos of baby Dan in my arms, photos of his first day of school, photos of his graduation with Arthur and me at his side. But there were also new photos. Photos from the hospital with Sam, photos from the park, photos from the recent dinners. And between the photos, there were small, handwritten notes. One said, "Thanks for not giving up on us." Another said, "Sorry it took us so long to value you." And at the end of the album, on the last page, there was a recent photo of all of us together in the backyard, smiling. Below it said, "This is our second chance, and this time, we're going to do it right." Tears ran down my cheeks without permission. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of liberation, of closure, of a painful chapter that was finally finding its peace. "Thank you," I whispered, hugging the album to my chest. "This means more than you can imagine." Dan came closer and hugged me. Laura joined the hug, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel tension in that contact. I only felt family. Imperfect, broken, mended with effort and therapy, but family nonetheless. That night, back in my apartment, I placed the album on the table and looked at it for hours. Each photo was a reminder that people can change, that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but releasing the weight of resentment. That true love isn't the kind that never breaks, but the kind that finds a way to rebuild itself after it shatters. Delia knocked on my door with wine and chocolates. "How was the birthday?" she asked. I showed her the album without saying anything. She leafed through it slowly, reading each note, observing each photo. When she finished, her eyes were moist. "You did the right thing, Lucy. By leaving, you taught them something they wouldn't have learned otherwise, that you weren't an entitlement, you were a gift. And gifts should be cared for." We toasted to that, to the gifts we learned to care for, to the second chances we dared to take. The following months brought a new routine. Sam visited me at my apartment once a month. He had his own corner with paints, small canvases, and brushes of all sizes. We would paint together for hours, not talking much, just creating. He would make dinosaurs of impossible colors, I would make landscapes that never existed. And in that shared silence, we found something more valuable than words: connection. Dan invited me to lunch every 2 weeks. Sometimes we went to restaurants. Sometimes he cooked at home. We talked about his job, his fears as a father, and how therapy was helping him understand patterns he had carried since his own childhood. There were no longer any forbidden topics. There were no more elephants in the room. There was just honesty, sometimes uncomfortable, but always necessary. Laura and I even went to a flower market together one afternoon. She needed ideas for the garden and asked for my advice. We walked among the stalls, talking about soil and fertilizers, and suddenly we realized that we were having a normal conversation, without tension, without hidden agendas, just two women sharing a common interest. It was strange and beautiful at the same time. One night, while painting on my balcony, I received a message from Dan. "Mum, can you come over tomorrow? There's something important we want to tell you." My first instinct was to worry, but I was no longer the same woman who jumped to the worst-case scenario. Now I trusted that if something was wrong, they would tell me directly. "Sure," I replied. "What time?" "At 10 o'clock. And bring an appetite. I'm going to make your favorite breakfast." I arrived the next day with curiosity. Dan greeted me with a long hug. We went into the kitchen where Laura and Sam were waiting. On the table was a full breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit, orange juice. But there was also something else: a cream-colored envelope with my name on it. "Sit down, Mom," Dan said with a mysterious smile. I opened the envelope with slightly trembling hands. Inside was a legal document. I read it once, then again. I didn't fully understand what I was seeing. Dan sat across from me. "Mum, after everything that happened, Laura and I did the math. We calculated how much money you invested in this house. The $150,000 for the down payment, the 3 years of mortgage payments, everything. And we decided it wasn't fair. This house exists because of you, so we talked to a lawyer and we prepared this. It's a document that names you as a co-owner of the house. 50% is legally yours." I was speechless. Laura spoke. "Lucy, this isn't charity. It's not guilt. It's justice. This house should have always been partially yours, and we want to make it official. If one day you decide to sell it or do something with your part, it's your right. But we also want you to know that you will always have a place here, not as a renter, as an owner, as family." Tears came without warning, not for the money, not for the house, but for what it represented, a tangible apology that went beyond words. "I don't know what to say," I whispered finally. Sam came closer and put his small hand on mine. "Say yes, Grandma. Say you accept. Because I want this to be your house too." I looked at my grandson, with those eyes full of innocence and hope. I looked at Dan, my son who had finally learned what it meant to be a good man. I looked at Laura, the woman who had been my enemy and was now trying to be my ally. And I looked at the document, that piece of paper that represented years of pain turned into something new. "I accept," I said finally, "but not because I need the house. I accept it because it represents something more important, that you finally understand my value. And that is priceless." We had breakfast together that morning with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. We laughed, we told stories. Sam asked me to tell him what Dan was like as a child, and I shared anecdotes that made him blush. Laura asked about my upcoming painting exhibition at the community centre and promised to be there. Dan asked me if Arthur would be proud of how we had fixed things. "Yes," I replied without hesitation. He always believed in second chances. and in forgiveness that is earned, not given. You all earned this. When I left that day, I drove back to my apartment with the document in my purse and a feeling of completeness in my chest. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't a movie reconciliation where everything went back to the way it was before. But it was real. It was honest. It was a new beginning built on the rubble of the past. That night, I put the document in my memory box, along with the letters from Dan and Sam, along with the photo album, along with the old photograph of Arthur. They were pieces of a complicated, painful story, but finally at peace. And as I looked at the city lights from my balcony, with a cup of tea in my hands and the soft sound of the wind in the plants, I understood something fundamental. Happiness isn't in perfect endings, it's in brave beginnings, in daring to leave when it's necessary, in daring to return when it's possible, in daring to forgive without forgetting, in daring to love oneself as much as one loves others. Maybe this wasn't the life I imagined when Arthur died. Maybe it wasn't the perfect family I dreamed of having. But it was mine. Completely, authentically, painfully, beautifully mine. And for the first time in years, that was more than enough. It was everything.